Professor Michael Hitt is a distinguished research fellow at Texas Christian University and a University Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Texas A&M University. His research has been published widely, and he is a highly regarded scholar in management. In the following lecture, Professor Hitt discusses how the new normal environment requires firms to act strategically and entrepreneurially in order to develop new competitive advantages. He gives examples to illustrate his point and discusses where future research can make contributions.
Now let me begin. If you were here yesterday, talking about the new normal. In fact, our previous speaker used that term, and that's become a term I've seen in a lot of different, used in a lot of different ways, used in business, used by politicians, used by a number of others, the new normal. Now this goes back in history, in time. I really became interested in what was happening in this environment, this competitive landscape, back in the mid-90s. And then we carry forward. We know that because of technological change, it's been amazing in terms of the changes that have occurred. Now that's technology related, but it's not all. I mean, we don't have to be in a technology-based industry for innovation and for change to be relevant. And we know where we are today, and again, the term was coined by an executive that worked for PIMCO. He was the CEO for PIMCO. He talked about the new normal, and of course from an investment perspective, and he was driven by the things that had happened financially. And if you look at the political landscape, if you look at the changes in technology and changes in the labor markets, etc. But let me use another example. You look at the 2008 that I noted that occurred, the financial, in a sense, meltdown that occurred in the financial markets in the U.S. starting, but it emanated out over the rest of the world in different ways. Of course, we've come back from that, but interestingly also, last night and this morning, I read an article that was published in the New York Times yesterday. In that article, it said, you know, that the 2008 financial problems were caused by these bubbles, largely in the United States. And that was true in housing and in some other areas where there were just housing prices were up, and there were all kinds of things happening. Unfortunately, in this article, the person says, we've got the same problem today. Said, but the problem is different than it was in 2008. The bubbles don't exist in one country. The bubbles exist in many countries. Now, I'm not trying to scare you. I don't have any earthly idea but what he's saying is that the same pressures and the same things are happening that are building up, but they're building up on a broader scale. Now, why am I bringing this up? It's not to scare you, but to say we're in the new normal. You can't expect what is happening today to happen tomorrow. The conditions are going to be different. They're going to change. And what you have to be is prepared to handle it. Now, how can you handle it? You're going to have to probably also change and be adaptable, etc. And your organization or your company has to be change-oriented and adaptable. That means also being innovative and being ready in a condition such that you can deal with the changed environment that you can't easily predict what it will be or what will occur. And there are a lot of pressure points that set out there, and they're always going to be there. Even in good times, the pressure points are there for things to happen. They could be political changes that could occur that change and really roil what happens. It could be economic changes that may not be related necessarily to political change. It could be technological changes, such as the technological disruption that occurs and has occurred a number of times. If you look at Apple, in a period of 10 years, technology-based products that they introduced changed 4 industries in a period of 10 years. Now, they're not doing that now, but they did it at one time in a period of about 10 years. Now, that doesn't mean that Apple is the one you look at. There are going to be others. There are going to be a lot of others, maybe new new companies that will be doing this. But what you can bet is that things will change. If you are standing still, you're dying. I mean, I'm talking about an organization. If you're standing still, you're dying. So that's really the story of the new normal and what you have to do from a standpoint of innovation. That's why it's an innovation imperative. And by the way, I don't care what industry you're in. You'll see in a few minutes, I'm going to give examples across industries. And some of these industries are not what you think of as any way based in technology, but they are affected by technology or the changes that are occurring, and that therefore they have to do things. Now this, I use a couple of quotes. One's an old quote by Gary Hamel. He's been a consultant for a number of years. He said, "Don't perpetuate, innovate." All he's saying is you can't stand still. You can't stay static. You got to move and you got to do something, continue to innovate. He said that in 2000. So it's old, 17 years old, but it's still very relevant. In fact, it's even more relevant today than it was yesterday. Now, the other one that I actually like better is the one from Jeff Bezos, because I think that is it's certainly more current, but he's trying to describe something where he says we don't try to imitate competitors. That's not an issue. In fact, we think about our customers and develop innovative ways of serving them. And in fact, you have ways of innovating, and there's customer-based innovation that is relevant to how you do what you do. And of course, frankly, Amazon has done quite well, and it's changing a number of industries today with what they're doing. In the year 2000, Polaroid was one of the 50 top corporations in America by size and value. And then 2 years later, it went bankrupt, as I said before, because of a technology that was based outside of industry, imported into that industry, and essentially changed the whole industry. And again, the argument would be that who should have been doing this? It should have been Polaroid. Polaroid should have been doing it. They had the resources to do it. They had the capability. They had the customers. If they'd been thinking about ways to do it and serving, they could have done it and maintained their customer base, etc. Now, I've talked about this idea of strategic entrepreneurship. I'm going to give examples here that I believe very strongly that firms have to be both strategic and entrepreneurial. Actually, either one alone won't get you where you need to be, in my opinion, over time. And I'll give some examples. All we're talking about is simultaneously being strategic and entrepreneurial. Now that's, in one way you look at that and say, okay, well we can do that. That's easy to, if you think about it. I can be strategic, I can be entrepreneurial. In fact, a lot of what we just learned is talking about some of the things you have to do to be strategic and some of the things you have to be entrepreneurial. And you put those together to really make it work for you. And a lot of the things you do to exploit the opportunities require the strategic thinking. And so you have to create value. You have to find ways to not only identify opportunities, but to exploit them. Have any of you read a book, Only the Paranoid Survive? It was written by the CEO, former CEO of Intel, after he retired. And he wrote it. He was not the one that started the company, but he's the one that brought it to eminence. And one of the reasons it was able to sustain what it did. I use this example because it's a large company and show you can continue to be innovative. Now, it was in a high technology industry. They literally were developing technology that cannibalized their own products that were highly successful. And they did it before those products' success was running out. In fact, in many times, they took the place of those products long before their growth cycle would have ended. In other words, they would take, and I gave you the example of one that was brought out 1 year after the previous product was introduced that was very successful. That's the way they sustained their competitive advantage in a high technology industry. They continued to innovate, and they continued to innovate not just trying to incrementally improve the products that were highly successful, but developing new products that would take the place of those. They did it before their competitors could do it. Now, I'm going to use a classic example. Another classic example, Priceline.com started with a very unique reverse auction system. And at that time it was unique. So they had this reverse auction system where, in a sense, the customer names the price and then the company says whether they're going to meet it or not. That was a unique system, and it's more sophisticated than what I'm describing, obviously. But they did this, and then as they went forward, the problem with something like this is it's a service-based service. It's actually not hard to copy that or imitate it. They were very successful, obviously selling a large number of tickets in a time. When you're successful, you're going to invite competition. They invited competition. They had a number of actually fairly prominent competitors that stepped in the market, some that existed doing other things, but they could easily shift over, some that were developed by the airlines themselves to compete with them, some that were developed by other companies that had backing they had subsidiaries that developed to do this because they saw opportunity. They saw opportunity. It's already been shown by Priceline. In fact, some would directly copied what they did, their system. What a lot of them did is they said, well, you know, we can do this, but we can look at what they did, we can do it better. That happens a lot when companies bring out new products. And either to improve that product, in this case a service, we can add some other services that will add value to it and make it more attractive to the customers. And that's what they did. Now again, what I'm describing to you is a very entrepreneurial firm that really found a great idea or had this discovery and moved it into a market, was successful with it, but did not take actions from a strategic standpoint. They did nothing except for the patent to forestall, to set up some kind of barriers to entry or to forestall others from entering and imitating, and or to stay ahead of that competition, assuming that that's going to happen. So they hadn't even thought through that process. Now that's not necessarily uncommon, but in this case they had some very significant competition, took market share away. Now they then did go to court. Now there's another side to this. For those that copied enough of their system that they felt that it infringed on their patent. When he talked about patents, patents are valuable, but you have to defend those. You have to take action to defend it. They did take it to court. But realize, you have to have resources to do that. And a young company generally doesn't have those resources to maybe sustain it over time. If some of those were, and some of those came from larger companies or had larger companies supporting them, that they could not sustain it in court because they just, even if they lost, they're going to appeal it. It goes on and on. And then eventually they had to quit. Priceline.com, the patent was useful, but not really that valuable to it to stop the copying of it because they could not, from a financial standpoint, carry it through the court system and long enough in order to stop the others from doing it. What they should have done is more strategically to develop other ways to step ahead and keep improving, not only their system, but in other ways, adding services that would keep them ahead of their competition. And there are probably other things they could have done as well. But that's thinking strategically. Now, the other example here is Amazon. Now, I just had a quote from Bezos. Now, Amazon started essentially in 1995. And that was in the early stages of bringing the internet into use from a business standpoint. And they were one of the early ones that did that. They came into an industry. Bezos had this idea. He was not technology-oriented. He was more finance-oriented from where he came from. But he had this idea and vision of what he could do. And so to use this technology and bring products to the market and sell them through the internet. Of course, he stepped in, as you well know, books and then the music. Amazon today is looking at establishing its second headquarters. Now, the value of that, they claim, to the community is that within a short period of time, and I don't know what that is, that they plan to add 50,000 jobs at that new headquarters. So that there's some competition to get them to come in there. Now, you think about that. Now, what are they doing? They're selling anything and everything that you can think of almost on the internet. What's that doing to businesses that are not generally thought of as technology-based? Well, there are a lot of major retailers that are being affected very negatively by this. As noted on this slide, that there are 10,000 retail stores that will close in the U.S. by the end of this year. All I'm trying to say to you, this is the new normal. This is bringing a technology, using a technology, bringing it into another industry and using it in a way that will have an impact and will impact the market, impact the sales, etc. So you have to think. Now you look at that and think of how many, now Bezos started this in books, then music. I say Bezos because he's the one that had those ideas originally, and now they've expanded it into others. Why didn't these others see this and try to forestall it, find ways to forestall it? All I can say is there are a lot of them that were wealthier in terms of resources, richer in terms of resources, could have done things that did not. So they didn't think entrepreneurially, and they probably weren't thinking strategically because they never saw that as a threat at that time. They were looking at specific industries. We say, well, that's all right. I don't sell books. I don't sell music. I don't sell other things. So you have to watch out. Now, this is just a model that I talk about in terms of strategic entrepreneurship, saying you've got to have resources. You have to have resources to make it work. So you have the resources, both internal and external. And no company, as I said, I don't know of any corporation that totally has all the resources it needs internally to do everything it needs to do. Even the large, very resource-rich companies have a large number of external alliances, and there are reasons for that. That some of it's for efficiency purposes, but some of it's to obtain knowledge and information and work together on innovation in some cases. And then you have to manage that in some way to take advantage of the opportunities, and then you create the value. And you have to think about the value you're creating and think about the customers and direct what you're doing toward those customers. The competitive advantage is a value that's created for the customer. That's when you have an advantage over your competitors. So that's the value you're trying to create, is superior value. You're providing customers superior value, new or unique value. And of course, then there are benefits that come both back to the individuals, to the organization, and frankly, to society. Now, I also talked about that there are differences across countries. And I think this is important for a whole variety of reasons. I'm not going to go through a lot of this today, except to say that there are. Now, in the presentations today, we've talked about different, where regulations have an impact on what happens with companies, legal issues, and how and they know that this varies by country. I think the important part of this is that there are a variety of factors that occur over time that you have to consider. And you have to consider both the governance of the organization, you have to consider the countries that you operate in, and their, as we call it, their institutions, their culture, etc. I gave the example of the companies that went into China with R&D operations, actually fairly early, many of them, at a time when China had weaker intellectual property protection laws and regulations, certainly weaker enforcement of it. And they did that, though primarily they were trying to develop products. They had R&D operations in China. They were doing it trying to develop products to reach the Chinese market. Now that's certainly a positive thing, but what they found and what they learned from this, besides that, is that they found that they were gaining value, information, knowledge in those R&D operations that helped them build products that were valuable in other parts of the world, not only in China. Now, what this has led to for a lot of those companies, now some may have known this otherwise, but what some of those companies learned from that is that they can learn by moving into different countries because of the value of different ways people understand things, that they have different knowledge bases to a degree. They have different cultures, so they look at things differently, and they add, then there's new ideas that when you can add that together and put it together, you can develop products or services that had value to many others. And so companies have been starting to develop regional R&D centers to gain value from this, because they see that the different cultures, language, we learn differently. We know this from the things that we do. And so if you go across country, if you've spent time in a lot of other countries, you learn that there's a lot of value that coming from different cultural values and ways of seeing things, looking at things. So when you look at that, you say you're in a new normal environment, there are ways you have to look at this, and you have to consider many of the companies, and frankly even new companies, are almost international in their inception, because they either build in one place, but they may serve markets outside of their home country, and often do now. And of course that's one of the values of having a larger market and where you can go. But in doing that, a lot of companies that are international, if you will, multinationals, and they gain value from that, there are a lot of other values that they can gain in doing it. Now let's take the GE example, because I'm talking about strategic entrepreneurship. A great example of more efficiency-based originally with Jack Welch. And actually when Jack went in, he was very efficiency-oriented. When he first started as CEO of GE, he's very efficiency-oriented and really forced a lot of efficiencies that added value, because GE had some problems at that time. And he really added value by reducing costs and adding value through the efficient systems that he created. Over time, he became more strategic. During that time, there were a lot of executives. That was a proving ground or a training ground for a lot of other top executives that move into other companies because of the success that GE enjoyed under Jack Welch. It was largely a success due to really first efficiency, and then had kind of a strategic approach. But it wasn't innovative. When Jeff Immelt took over, one of the things that he saw was what was happening out here in this environment. He started creating more value through changing GE to become more innovative. And actually, from all I know and learned, and both read, observe, and I knew people working with Immelt, that he did change that system fairly dramatically. And they were more innovative in their separate businesses. And that added value. They were adding value in GE. Yet, in this year, the stock price has gone down 44%. And you say, why? And this is interesting. In a booming stock market, the stock price has gone down 44%. So why? Well, one of the reasons, starting back, you started seeing some problems in that it had these businesses. It was more of a diversified firm, not necessarily related. For example, one of its, I'll call it cash cows, but a very successful part of their business for a number of years was in financial services. Now it's interesting. Financial services, jet engines, railroad parts, appliances, energy business or power business, power generation, power equipment business. You look at that, some of them seemed to fit together, others didn't. Still, it was successful because of the things that Jack Welch did over time. And the innovation can be more innovative within those industries. But now what happens when some of those industries experience problems? Well, of course, 2008, there were some big blow-ups in the financial services industry, and that they lost significant amounts of money that reverberated, because that had been a cash cow for the rest of the business. Not that they weren't gaining value from the other, but now it was draining from it. Well, of course, they got rid of it. What happened is they lost the strategic focus, and they really needed to. For example, now they're downsizing, downscoping, as I would call it, the business, and selling off parts of the business. They're staying in, they're going to stay in this power, you can call it whatever you, I don't know what their term they call it, I'll call power generation, power equipment business. But in this year alone, that business is down 44%. The revenue worldwide is down 44%. That's what they're staying in. And it's down 44% because the renewable energy business is growing and taking business away. So their typical customers that they've sold to don't have need for extra equipment and so forth for the most part. And they laid off, just announced a big layoff in that particular part of the business of 12,000 employees. That's on a global basis. Now look at this. GE has gone from a very highly successful business. In fact, it was touted as one of the the type of business that others should follow in terms of the way it should be managed when Jack Welch had it. It was also touted because of Jeff Immelt's focus on innovation. So it's now experiencing something different. What happened is they were strategic, but they did things at a time where innovation may have been not unimportant, but less important in some of those industries. Then Jeff Immelt said, hey, we're in a different world now. We've got to be more innovative, and now they're more innovative, but they lost the strategic focus. They need to go back and still be looking at the business strategically, not only each one, but across those businesses. And they weren't doing it, evidently, until they got harmed. You can look at it retrospectively, but when you do, you're going to experience the harm and the value in it. So in a point of fact, here's a company, large company, successful company at one time, highly successful company, that was strategic, then innovative, but it wasn't, at the same time, they weren't strategically entrepreneurial. That's my point. Now, is this where I talked about the example of the Chinese companies? Because we learned that just moving into international markets adds value. And we, at this long time, and 20 years ago, we said that companies were gaining value by learning by moving into international markets, and that's why that their innovation was increased, although we weren't measuring the knowledge they learned at that time. Then we learned, as I said earlier, that it really varies by the institutions in the particular country what happens. So we talk about that companies then have to look at these institutions in each country. Ones they enter, they also have to understand their own, but certainly the ones they enter. And we've studied them, we've looked at individual factors such as the amount of political risk in terms of potential change of governments, or intellectual property protection, the impact that may have. But we haven't looked at them in this kind of combined way, because when a company moves into a new international market, it can't just consider one factor. Generally doesn't just consider one factor. And again, the example I just gave you about the Western companies largely moving into China with R&D operations is a prime example of that. If we looked at intellectual property protection, it would say these technology-based businesses, which a lot of them were, would not enter that market at that time with R&D operations. But in point of fact, they did. So there were other institutional factors that were drawing them there. So that, again, an example of where you combine, you have to look at a broader set of institutions, and that they have it combinative, and that they are multiple levels, I noted earlier. I've left a name in here of Elinor Ostrom, because she won a Nobel Prize for her work. And essentially, what she found and what she said is that you have local institutions that also impact. And we collected primary data from companies in 17 different countries. I'm going to focus on a few of the results. First, it says that firms in resource-rich environments were more likely to employ entrepreneurial strategies. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it doesn't tell you much. It tells you that they do. But that says all firms in these industries are more likely. What it tells you, if you're a company in a resource-rich environment, you better be ready to engage in entrepreneurial strategy. One, you don't have the risks that may involve because the resources are more available, so it reduces it. Not saying you have no risk, but it reduces your risk in one side, but you have another risk. The other risk is you have a lot of other competitors that are engaging in those strategies. If you don't engage in it, you won't stay there long. Certainly in a resource-rich environment, some of these companies are going to develop products that will take over the market or in some way add value to the market, and if you don't, they will take market share away from you. So if you're in that kind of environment, you have to be ready to engage in that kind of strategy or you will not stay successful. Move down. Firms are reluctant to employ a entrepreneurial strategy in a dynamic environment. Again, it doesn't make sense because That's where you need to in this kind of environment. Technology-based industries tend to be very dynamic and change-oriented. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all this way. I mean, there are other industries are change-oriented. Now, what we're saying, and this is what I have found over time dealing with a lot of different companies, now this is going across industries, is that one of the things that happens when firms get into dynamic times, because the risk is higher, uncertainty is higher, the tendency, now this is an individual tendency, and remember, companies are run by people, is to pull back, contain. And I learned, going back to a study done with a PhD student back in the 1980s, actually, when we studied this, actually, we studied that companies in more uncertain environments tended to pull back, become more restrained. They would invest less in developing and moving into other areas, and they would become more centralized, and they didn't then respond. They were trying to contain the negative effects of this uncertain environment and trying to reduce their own uncertainty, but they don't. They reduce their uncertainty maybe for a while, but if they do that, their uncertainty is going to increase. What we found is companies that had strong relationships with their stakeholders. One of their important stakeholders are customers. But they have strong relationships. They're not just having contacts. They're not just establishing reliances. They have strong relationships with them. Some of them, they may be working with them to create more innovation. So the entrepreneurial strategy is not necessarily always internal. It could be working across those lines. But they're working with them. So where they have strong relationships, they are more likely to engage. And that these relationships reduce uncertainty. And they do. They do reduce uncertainty. They also provide other resources and input. But if these are not just large corporations, some of them are smaller companies, and you may have to work together. You may have to partner to share your resources to create something new. But you can do that and do it well and hopefully do it effectively if you build the relationships, have strong relationships with those that you consider stakeholders. So those are the ones that will win in those kinds of environments. You know, this other study I'm going to talk just briefly about. I'm going to talk about a couple of the findings again. This is a study we did across 4 countries, and these were entrepreneurial firms, new venture firms, less than 6 years old, as noted. Now, one of those is that those working in countries with weaker institutions and less efficient institutions, as we noted, actually build social networks that are more diverse, with more diverse contacts. But that gives you access to more information, knowledge, and these can be partners. They're partners in some cases in things you do, particularly for these entrepreneurial firms. And then you go down, and what you learn is that those particular relationships become very critical, oftentimes, to their ability to actually gain more value, perform better. We measure performance in terms of growth for those particular companies. Of course, it was more important in the weaker institutional environments, but by the way, it's important in all of the institutional environments. It's just that it was more important there because they didn't have the support base from those institutions. So they even had to depend more heavily on those social network contacts. And that actually was very valuable for these. And we did, again, a large number of entrepreneurs across 4 different countries, as I noted. And so we have very direct data from the entrepreneurs where we talked to them, we interviewed them, we talked to them, went back to them, collected more data. Now I'm going to talk about 2 other studies, and I'm going to put these together. These 2, because to me they do fit together. These are smaller in terms of number, but our focus was different. We didn't on institutions, talking about what they do, the kind of strategies they employ, and how the capabilities they built, and then how they did this for innovation. We were focused on innovation, how they created innovation. And what we found, we looked at this one, you look at across the life cycle of firms, and we were specifically looking at, it would be younger in their life cycle Not necessarily younger in age, because age of the firm is correlated with their life cycle stage, but it's not necessarily equal to. So some developed much faster and became, I guess, mature firms much faster, for example. Some it takes longer. But to say those were in the more entrepreneurial growth stage, obviously we're trying to obtain more resources. But when you compare them with the more mature firms, there are a lot of these firms that are mature that you could name, some of them we talked about already, that in fact those mature firms did not then focus on engaging, many of them. Now again, this is on average, because this doesn't say no mature firm was doing this, but looking at across these 189 firms, that we found that in general, the entrepreneurial firms were engaging in trying to build new capabilities and trying to enrich their current capabilities, but develop new ones that would help them be more innovative. Now, what I also entail from this, and I didn't go into this we haven't gone into this in this slide, but in fact, they're the ones that are more likely to develop the more radical or disruptive technologies. And many of these mature firms, what they were doing, and I know this because we talked to these directly, we got data directly from them, is they were trying to improve on their current products. Now that's not bad. As he said, those really can help you in the short term, but that's only going to help you in the short term, not in the long term. If you look at some of these companies, now look at Polaroid. It was trying to continue to improve the technology it had then, trying to develop a technology that was, at that time, very important, very valuable, etc., but there was another new technology about to take its place, and they didn't realize it until it was too late, as you know. So that's trying to improve a technology that may not be valuable in the future if you're not careful. Then the second one, which really fits with this, because a lot of those mature firms were successful. That's why they made it to being mature firms. They were high-performing firms. So they were high-performing firms, and therefore they are mature firms. But when you get into this, one of the problems, and we know this from a lot of the, again, this gets down to individual psychology. I mentioned that the ones that developed, we call it prospect theory. You don't have to talk about it in terms of a theory, but it was based on, from psychologists that were trying to understand how people make decisions and under what conditions are they interested in trying to increase their gains and where they're trying to manage and forestall losses. And they found that when they were doing very well, when they were, in this case, high-performing firms, translating it in our situation, they were trying to manage their losses oftentimes. In other words, that you become successful because you've done something very well, and you don't want to change it because you've got it. You want to protect it, so you try to incrementally stay ahead. You keep developing it, maintain your advantage, hopefully in this. But the one problem you have is when you're doing that, there may be something else more valuable out there that's going to come take its place, and the likelihood is today it is going to happen. So if you take this approach, which is a human tendency, because these are psychologists that were studying it and how humans act in a whole variety of situations. But of course, they won the Nobel Prize for economics because it affects the economic behavior. But we're translating it for businesses and top executives who are human beings. And so they make decisions like this as well. And then the others that are trying to gain, they tend to be the lower performing in this case. Now, I'm not going to say they're always the lower performing to do this. Now let's put these two together. Generally, your entrepreneurial growth firms are successful, so maybe they're performing reasonably well, but they're not at the stage of a lot of these mature firms that have been very successful. So their performance, if we measure it from a financial perspective, is higher, stronger. So they're still trying to find ways to get to that stage and to really get into the market. So they are still trying to gain value. They're seeking gain. These firms are trying to protect against loss. And in those opportunities, when that happens, it's going to be a problem. Now, in this new normal environment, I could name a large number of retailers that have been trying to protect against loss. They performed well. At one time, they were very successful, and you could look at it in different parts of the world. But today, Amazon or some other firm in different countries is going to come take their market away from them. Because a lot of people still now have learned that they prefer to shop, more convenient to shop from home or from work or from some other place, you don't have to go physically to the stores because traffic can be a problem, time is a problem, etc. You can use your time more valuably. So, there are things you have to do in this new environment that you have to forestall, and you have to be innovative. Now let me end, and I'm going to really just go down to the end of this ambidexterity. What that says is you've got to be ambidextrous to be strategic and entrepreneurial. Now, what they talk about, is this ambidextrous that they're talking about is talking about learning. It comes from organizational learning and how we learn to be to exploratory learning and exploitative learning. Explore for opportunities, exploit those opportunities. Let me just end with another side if you want to think about that. My son is ambidextrous. It makes me think about it. He does a lot of things left-handed. In sports, he did things left-handed, but he writes right-handed. He could do actually both things. So he's ambidextrous. I have two beautiful little granddaughters that are twins, and they're mirror twins. And they are identical twins in their looks. In fact, I have trouble. If I'm not careful, I can't tell them apart. They'll come up and tell me, I'll say their names are Ashley and Aubrey. And I'll come up and say, if I'm not careful, I'll call one of them by one name and say, no, I am Aubrey or I am Ashlyn. Now, if I observe them, though, I can tell the difference because their personalities are different. They're mirror twins. They have different capabilities. One's very creative. One's very analytical. They're both extremely intelligent, which I'm very proud of, but they have different capabilities. But if you put those two together, amazing what you can do. The analytical and the creative, the strategic and the entrepreneurial. I hope you've enjoyed and you've learned something from our talk today. Thank you.